People will be drifting in, but we don't want to get too far out of our timeline here. So I'm privileged to introduce our next moderators, who will introduce the speakers for the next session on clinical trials in cancer health disparities, comparing real-world evidence with evidence from randomized controlled trials, among other things. So the co-chairs for this session will be Dr. Suraj Nirala and Dr. Kelly Shanahan, and I'll let you folks go ahead and introduce the speakers and say a little bit about yourself.
Hi, I'm Dr. Kelly Shanahan. I kind of joke around that I used to be a doctor because after 25 years of practicing OBGYN, I became a patient, and I have metastatic breast cancer, and I've been living with metastatic breast cancer for 5 years. So I went from a paid job as one of you guys to an unpaid job where I travel around doing advocacy. But as I say, I'm not dead yet, and I look forward to helping to moderate this session.
Hi, I'm Suraj Nirala. I'm one of the medical oncologists from Nepal. Right now I'm practicing in Canada, in Manitoba, with University of Manitoba and Cancer Care Manitoba, where I focus on breast cancer treatment with research interest in clinical trials methodology, global oncology, among others. So it's a real privilege to introduce our esteemed guests or speakers today. The first one would be Dr. Chadi Naban. He's an Executive Vice President and Chief Medical Officer at Aptitude Health. He is an innovative physician, executive, and a leader in driving transformational changes in healthcare. Prior to joining Aptitude Health, he has held numerous leadership positions, including in Cardinal Health and Clinical Cancer Center at University of Chicago. Dr. Naban has published over 200 peer-reviewed articles, including abstracts, book chapters, and serves as editor in many scientific journals, including the JAMA Oncology. Dr. Naban is a highly sought-after leader and moderator by all stakeholders in cancer care and in all medical disciplines. So join me in welcoming Dr. Chadi Naban.
Actually, I had no idea who you were talking about. I was looking around. I'm not really sure I deserve this introduction, but thank you very much, and thanks for the kind invitation. The one thing I admit I'm going to be struggling with is I'm not used to being behind the podium. I usually like to walk around when I'm talking, but I'll do my best to be disciplined. These are my disclosures, and Dr. Guwali reminds me I have to put it for about 6 seconds before I move them, so everybody can know my disclosures. All right, so I know that we don't have an ARS type device that I could ask the audience to answer, so maybe we'll do this by raise of hands, but it's important. So when prescribing Sutent for renal cell carcinoma, what dosing schedule do you typically start? Do you start with 4 weeks on followed by 2 weeks off? Do you start by 2 weeks on followed by 1 week off? Other schedule, or you don't prescribe Sutent for renal cell carcinoma, or you don't treat renal cell carcinoma. Now again, I know we don't have that system that you can answer, so by raise of hands, who would answer A? Only one. Bishal, you're the only one who actually prescribed that. Who would answer B? Okay, we have a little bit more. Who would have a different schedule? Other. C. Okay, so at least it's between A and B. Let me move on to another question. When prescribing single-agent capecitabine in combination with radiation therapy for localized rectal cancer, what dosing regimen do you typically start with? So who would raise their hands for 825 milligram per square meter BID? Got 2. Who would do 825 milligram per square meter QD? No one would do that. 1,000 milligram per square meter BID. We have 4. 1,250 milligram per square meter BID. No one? Other regimen I don't know about? Okay, no one. Another question. Regarding dose, schedule, or regimen makeup, how often does your treatment differ from the FDA label due to your clinical experience? And I promise you, whatever your answer is, nobody will take you out of this room. There's no punitive anything about this. You actually deviate, whenever you use the term deviate, people told me, don't use deviate. People just don't respond very well. That's called like the behavioral psychology of how you would answer a question. So how is it very often you would do that? Moderately often, somewhat often, not very often, or not at all. Whatever the dose that the FDA has, this is the one that you abide with until death do you part. Which one? Number one, very often. Moderately often. Right, I like honesty. Somewhat often. Good. Not very often. All right, well, congratulations. You live in the real world. Okay, and every time I say the real world, people come back and say, well, are you contending there's an unreal world? Isn't it really all about the real world? But that's what I'm going to spend the next 25 minutes on, is to explain the importance of that real world that we live in. You just already, in the first 2 minutes, you realize there's variations in what we do. It's not uniform what we are doing. So there's a lot of variability into what we do, what we prescribe. That's actually the real world. And the importance of the real world is hopefully highlighted on this slide, depicted slightly. Again, not everything. But remember that because we have a lot of advances in science and medicine and oncology, we are aging. We are living longer. However, this aging population is awfully represented in clinical trials. Patients over the age of 65 represent only 25% of clinical trial patients, but 61% of real-world patients. And if you just try to Google the US Census and the predictability of how many older patients we will have at 2030, you'll be really impressed with these stats. And of course, when I use the term older, I will be countered by, well, what do you mean by older? What's the cutoff? So I'm going to avoid that cutoff just in case there's somebody in this room over the age of 40. How about diversity, patient diversity? 90% of clinical trial patients are white, Caucasians. Nothing wrong with that, but that doesn't represent the demographics of the United States of America. 25% of the US population is non-white, and it's growing. So basically, I'm enrolling young white patients in clinical trials, and I'm taking the results of that, and I'm applying it to non-white, older people in the US. Does it make sense? I don't know. You'll have to tell me. But not only that, guess what? From the young white folks that we enroll in clinical trials, only 3 to 5% we enroll of them. So only 3 to 5% of the adult cancer population get enrolled in clinical trials, and I take usually the results and the output of those 3 to 5%, whatever I get, and apply to the 95% of people that have never been enrolled in a clinical trial. How in the world does this make sense? It doesn't make sense, but that's the real world that we live in. That's the world that we live in. I'm going to show you a couple of examples in terms of just, by the way, this slide clearly depicts my lack of command of PowerPoint. This is probably absolutely, if there's an award to the ugliest PowerPoint slide during this session, it's going to be this. But what you get from me is unfiltered. There's no really Photoshop here. I copied and pasted from like a package insert, and what you'll see here, the dosage and administration of Zilloda is 1250. I don't think I have a laser pointer to show you, so hopefully you could see that. 1250 milligram per square meter. I don't see patients currently, but I've never prescribed that dose. It was 1,000 milligram per square meter BID when you prescribe, because nobody could tolerate the 1250 milligram per square meter. But that's actually the dose. The Sutent that you see here is for GIST and advanced RCC, 50 milligram orally, daily, with and without food, and so forth. So, That's really what happens, and then these drugs get approved, and we're in the real world now, and, we have to figure out what to do. If you go to PubMed and you put real-world evidence in the search engine, you will get over 6,000 articles on PubMed. I have a couple on that there. But I can tell you that it is not well defined. I'll spare you the search. It's not well defined. It depends on who you ask, who you talk to. The FDA attempted to define real-world evidence and real-world data, and they actually have a program, real-world evidence program framework. And they said that data relating to patient health status or the delivery of healthcare routinely collected from variety of sources. Thank you for clarifying. I'm pretty sure this actually made it very clear to all of you who are listening. But I like the last bullet point here, and I'd like you to think of it, because I do think it's important. The FDA will use the real-world evidence and real-world data to monitor post-marketing. What happens actually post-marketing in the commercial space after the drugs get approved? Maybe that will help. And I'm hoping to convince you that it does help more than randomized controlled trials that we keep talking about. Now, I'm going to tell you how I define real-world evidence. I don't think my definition is necessarily unique. I think hopefully it's probably similar to a lot of how you guys define real-world evidence. But my definition of real-world evidence is, this is simply evidence that will be generated from real-life practices, where patients are treated routinely outside of randomized clinical trials or other types of studies. These are the 95% of patients that you are seeing in your clinic. Now, some institutions may enroll 20% of their cancer patients on clinical trials. Others may enroll, right? I mean, MD Anderson, Memorial, the large academic centers, they enroll more. Mayo, I don't want anybody from Mayo to be upset. I was getting the frown. Somebody in the back was like, how about us? But that doesn't represent the real world. So my definition is, what evidence can I gather as an oncologist, as somebody interested in healthcare delivery, from patients who are not enrolled on these strict clinical trials? What does real-world evidence, to me, allow me to study? It allows me to study disease burden in a larger population. Yes, you can have 500 patients enrolled in a prospective randomized controlled trials. How does this really apply to thousands of patients in terms of the disease burden, hospitalization, cost? It allows me studying diseases in understudied cohorts. I did, again, understudied, the older, African Americans, other folks who are not enrolled in clinical trials. Adherence. Sure, in clinical trials, you have to make sure your patient is getting the drug. Otherwise, you'll be cited if you're audited. There's an unintended consequences if this doesn't happen. You don't want to lose your NCI Comprehensive Cancer Center designation. That would be awful, because then the center next door will actually that's how the real world needs to look at adherence. How often do patients actually get this treatment? Toxicities and adverse events in populations that were not studied. And I'll share with you some data, and then patient behaviors. I'm going to ask a question that I need an honest answer from those of you who do clinical trials in the audience. How many times did you want to enroll a patient on a clinical trial, and the clinical trial said that the minimum platelets count had to be 100,000? The patient comes in, the trial is great. This is an excellent candidate. You run the platelets, it's 98,000. You call the lab, it's still 98,000. Darn it. How many of you have said, okay, I'm going to transfuse you with 1 unit of platelets? I've done it. I know Julie is shaking her head, but could be hemoglobin. Forget the platelets. Maybe the platelets was hemoglobin 7.9. 7.9, Julie. And the minimum was 8. And you repeat it. You say, well, I can give, you're short of breath. I'll give you 1 unit of blood. It'll be over 8. I'll enroll you next week. I've done it because clinical trials are so restrictive. So I thought to myself, I'm going to do an experiment. I went to clinicaltrials.gov. Now, for those of you who know me, you know I'm interested in CLL and lymphoma, but I know enough about other cancers to be dangerous in a conversation. So, you know, I know about Zilloda and sunitinib. I went to clinicaltrials.gov. You could do this exercise, by the way. I did this like a couple of weeks ago when Binay kept emailing me, where are the slides? I looked at CLL. I looked at recruiting studies, so active studies. I specifically wanted to look at patients over 65. And by the way, for those of you who are going to argue with me that there are some studies that look at older patients in clinical trials, those older patients that get enrolled in clinical trials, it's selection bias. They're not the older patients in real life. These are the older patients who have good psychosocial support, they're able to travel to the academic site, they're able blah, 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 blah. So I went here and I said, I'm going to look at older patients over 65. Again, I'm not saying over 65 is old. Binay, don't worry, I'm kidding. I looked at phase 3 interventional studies because I know Dr. Giwali here loves phase 3 interventional studies. I found 16 trials. Recruiting for CLL in allowed patients over 65, good, and they're all interventional studies. So I went to the eligibility criteria. All of these patients, by the way, had to have a GFR over 70. Over 70. So, you know, if you're 70 years old and your creatinine is 1.45 or 1.5, you may not qualify. We want you over 70 GFR. Adequate liver function tests. Requirement, you cannot be on treatment with a strong CYP3A4 and CYP3A4 inhibitors or inducers. Wonderful. It excludes patients with anticoagulation with warfarin. Great. It excludes any comorbidity or organ system impairment rated with a single CIRS, cumulative illness rating score, of over 4. I mean, really? So I'm allowing the older patients, but I need to have the wonderful LFTs. Maybe you should ask that you can run the Boston Marathon. This is the world of clinical trials that we live in. But clinical trials are sexy. They get you on the podium. You get the ASCO plenary session, the ASH oral sessions. They're nice. Real world evidence, we're just like behind, just trying to have some relevance, the 95% of us that live in the real world. So what is really driving real world evidence, aside from me being passionate about it? The FDA recognized this, and again, they've recognized this for a long time, but I think now there's some action to it. So the 21st Century Cures Act requires FDA to create a process to the use of real-world evidence to allow the support of marketing of products to get approved. Now, we have to demonstrate effectiveness of these products because this actually ties into payments, oncology care model, and reimbursement, all of these things. Also, real-world evidence allows identifying patient subpopulations that you can study these drugs more effectively in. You're able to actually subcategorize. So, and of course, you have the claims and everything. So the results is an increased use of real-world evidence earlier in drug development. Now the manufacturers realizing, well, real-world evidence actually is important. Frankly, manufacturers have realized the importance of this way before academicians, because they understand that in order for drugs to be successful commercially, the real world has to take them and apply them. Otherwise, you know, you actually don't recoup the cost of the drug development that you spend over the past 5-6 years. And there are many examples of drugs that did not pan out commercially because they just, the plan did not really recognize the difference between real world and clinical trials. Now, but real world evidence, yes, I like it. I believe there's a lot of things we can learn from it, and I'm hoping, you know, that you're going to agree with me by the end of this talk, but there are limitations. Let's be fair and balanced. There are limitations to real world evidence. It's not always great. There's absolutely potential of bias. Where do you get the source of that real world evidence? You just heard from Dr. Haddis, if you're doing a chart review, there's some structured, unstructured data. We all know that it's not perfect. The data quality and integrity could be questioned. I'm totally in agreement with that. It's not great always. there's absolute lack of standardization and harmonization. In clinical trial, you have to scan every 2 months, plus minus 1 week. In real world, maybe you don't do that. And if I'm scanning every 3 months and you're scanning every 4 months, how do we actually look at an endpoint, at a progression, at all of that stuff? So again, there's not that standardization. I think there's a lot of data sources out there for real world, by the way. I'm going to share that with you. But how do you aggregate all of this together? That's really unclear. And there's no question relevant to this meeting is there's a lot of global variation into how real world evidence varies. And I could tell you one of my interests, and part of the reason I have joined my current employer, is I'm very interested in real world outside the US as well, starting with the EU and then in Asia, because that real world evidence, if you agree to the definition, definitely differs between the US and EU and Asia. There's a cultural differences that dictates how people perceive treatment and outcomes of therapy. Now, Bishal, who is here in the audience, Dr. Giwali and myself, we challenged each other and we said, you know, we hear a lot about this precision medicine that we keep, you know, everything is precision. By the way, if you're going to get a paper accepted, just put precision medicine in there and just right there. My favorite word this year in any paper I'm going to participate in is called harmonized. So we thought to ourselves, okay, are there differences if we look at precision medicine as a particular way of treatment? How do randomized controlled trials differ than real-world evidence? And the reason I've asked Dr. Giwali and I to write about this is because he's a big proponent of RCT, and I'm a big proponent of RWE, and I thought the best way to bring somebody to your camp is by having him write a paper with you about this exact topic, but Bishal didn't know that. That was the plan. Now, I'm going to concede that randomized controlled trials are the gold standard for novel therapies to be approved and come to market. I don't believe that's something that anybody should argue about. I think it's very clear this is the gold standard to approve new drugs because you need to demonstrate efficacy against your control. Real-world evidence in that setting is complementary. I think it's important to look then what happens after that drug gets approved. The data source is obviously patients, but it's big data in real-world evidence. I'll just share with you a couple of things that I believe are challenging. Intervention, patient monitoring, and endpoints could vary, but real-world evidence brings you these large numbers of patients that could look at effectiveness versus efficacy, which I do think they are different, obviously, but you know, you can look at efficacy in that 500 patient population, but how about effectiveness in a larger patient population? And that's where I believe that we can hopefully find a common ground in what I'm talking about. So, can real-world evidence teach us anything? Sometimes. We can agree on sometimes, not always. There's a lot of bad studies on real-world evidence out there, but I think sometimes it can. We all need to keep an open mind about real-world evidence. And really, there's no way there's 5 minutes left. Seriously? I have 20 more slides. Can I get 5 minutes extension, please? I'll buy you coffee outside. Please, okay. Okay. It's about the patients, not about the trial design and the p-values. I just don't want us to always get hooked on the p-value and trial design. If I can get information that helps my patients from a real-world evidence study, then great. That's really very important. And we need to use that clinical judgment. Just because it's an observational study or real-world study, let's just not shrug our shoulder immediately. Let's just read it. Let's try to understand what it says. I'm going to share with you quick examples. So this is a correspondence that we actually wrote looking at reduced dose ibrutinib compared to standard dose ibrutinib in CLL. And what we found in a retrospective series that the low dose is equal to full dose. Now, this is not prospective. I'm not saying that you have to use the low dose, but what that tells me, if I have a patient in front of me, I had to reduce the dose because of toxicity, I'm not actually compromising efficacy. That's good information. We published this letter in Blood about ibrutinib-induced pneumonitis in patients with CLL. We found 4 to 5 patients who had pneumonitis that bad, documented by bronchoscopy. When you have time on the break, go back to the first paper that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine on ibrutinib by John Bird in relapse disease and then subsequently in frontline disease, and tell me if you see in the adverse events pneumonitis listed. No, it's not. I'll spare you. But it's real world that documented this, and right now people know pneumonitis actually could occur with these BTKs. This is a paper that looked at ibrutinib in frontline therapy in CLL. Bottom line that ibrutinib was equal to chlorambucil, but look at the inclusion criteria. All patients in this study were over 65, and they had no 17p deletion. I'm like, okay, so we decided to go, you know what? We're going to look at the opposite. We're going to look at over 65 and with 17p deletion, or we just have to look at patients who were not included. And we published this in the American Journal of Hematology, and we looked at the adverse events. Now, we can argue all we want, but look at the, and I apologize, no laser pointer. On your side, there's a pneumonitis. We found 2.3% pneumonitis in the patients in the real world. It was not reported in the study. AFib, we found 10.2%. In all grades, it was 6%. We had 4.1% grade 3-4, grade 3-4, 1.5%. Is there anybody in this room that could argue that there's value in this information when you're seeing a patient in the real world and you can tell them about pneumonitis and the higher risk of AFib that may be underreported in clinical trials? The answer is no. So, to that, I'm going to ask you a quick question by raise of hands. In deciding on the degree of toxicities your patients experience when they are treated outside of clinical trials, I use the CTCAE criteria. Always? How about often? Okay, not very often. I was in the not very often category. How about I utilize my clinical expertise? Exactly. But obviously, you know, clinical trials was CTCAE. I mean, you don't really go through your clinic when you have 25 patients in clinic and having the laminated cards. How about this one? Is Sarab Jaha here? Or is he having, oh, here he is. This is his favorite. This question is for Sarab. In assessing response to therapy, when I treat my solid tumor patients who are not enrolled on clinical trial, I always utilize RECIST. Who raises the hand? Sometimes. Okay. Or I utilize my clinical judgment, expertise in assessing response when I look at the studies, and I call Dr. Jeha and radiology. All right. But clinical trials said RECIST, measure that lymph node, make sure how many millimeters there, and I always know when Dr. Jaha is reading in his radiology room at UPenn because his tweets are usually firing Saturday morning anytime on call, critiquing oncologists for that. So, use of real-world data to generate real-world evidence. We have real-world data, gives us real-world evidence. And we have a variety of sources. I'm going a little bit faster, I apologize. A variety of sources that you can see here. Ideally, it gives you data analytics. You generate that evidence that hopefully shapes some of what we do. This is, again, an example of what we can use. Administrative claims. Anytime a patient in the USA touches the healthcare system, whether it's a CBC, a patient visit, hospital, blood transfusion, there's a claim that gets generated because somebody has to get paid. You can get the information from these claims. You may not get granular information, but you get enough information. You have electronic medical records. You have patient registries. We have observational studies. All of this information are very important to get all of this data that we want. The challenge is, how do we analyze this? Now, I'm going to get how this is going to reduce disparities in 1 second. But I want to make sure that we understand all of these sources that are available to us. The challenge for us is to know when to use what and why. That's really the challenge that we have. So healthcare costs in the US, is there anybody here who does not know? Dr. Rondelli, did you know that the healthcare in the US is actually exponentially rising? You did know that. Okay. Now I'm trying to find, Italy was not on the map here, so you guys are doing okay there. But basically you can see the rising cost in healthcare from 1970 to 2016 as compared to other industrialized nations, Austria, Canada, Germany, etc. Importantly, you look at the expenditure in healthcare as a percentage of the GDP product, and there's no question you can see where we are compared to other places in the map. So we're spending a lot of money, right? And we are spending a lot of percentage out of our GDP. We must be living longer. In the US, we live much longer than the Germans. They drink a lot of beer. But that's actually not the case. That was for Nicole. That's not the case. Look, these are the stats. These are the stats. Does spending more lead to better life expectancy? No. The data do not support that if you spend more, you're going to live longer. And you can see where we are on the curve in terms of the healthcare spending compared to the life expectancy, and you can see a lot of countries. So if we spend more, it doesn't mean we're going to live longer. So good information for our fellow Canadians. It's okay if you don't spend more. You're not going to die faster. So this is the dilemma that I have. As I look at the big picture, usually from where I sit, and we all know that randomized controlled trials are expensive. They are really expensive, very resource-driven. I already know that if I spend more, patients are not going to live longer. I just showed you that. That's the evidence. And I also know that low-middle-income countries and many other countries can't even spend a fraction of what we spend in the US. So I have studies that are expensive that I have not been able to show that if I spend that much money on them, people in my country here are going to live longer. I have other countries that don't even spend as much money. They can't do what we tell them they have to do, RCTs to improve things. That's where real-world evidence fits in. 2 more slides, I swear. I'm going as fast as possible. So that's where we need informative studies, scalable to low-middle-income countries, but that's where real-world evidence really fits in, because we cannot do randomized controlled trial for every single question under the sun. You can't answer everything with an RCT, please. You just can't. So, and I know real-world evidence is imperfect, but we live in it. I mean, this is the world we live in. We live in an imperfect world. Welcome. That's where we are. So we have to figure out what to do. Can we do studies? Yes, we have to figure out how to do studies in an imperfect world. The world we live in, doses sometimes vary, assessing response varies, patients are different, psychosocial, and you can list everything. Now, this is a long table. I'm not going to go through it, but simply talks about pragmatic clinical trials. I'm a big fan of pragmatic clinical trials. I refer you to a very good review in the New England Journal of Medicine, where I copied and pasted that table. I think I was having a better PowerPoint day here. And basically really talks about pragmatism in clinical trials. And I think that's a reasonable approach to real-world evidence type of thing. Okay, what is the path forward? And this is coming in press in the next couple of weeks in JAMA Oncology, because I've been criticized a lot about using the real-world media. I mean, sometimes I don't want to look at my Twitter feed because I'm like, what do you mean? We live in a real world anyway. So I decided to write something about real world. I think we need to standardize the methodologies by which we research real-world evidence. Real-world evidence is not going to go anywhere, so let's standardize the methodology. Let's agree we need to study it, and let's standardize the methodology of how we study it. Let's clarify when decision-making is warranted, since output from such research could have regulatory implications. Real-world data should be meaningful, valid, timely, transparent. Real-world evidence should not be used for approval of novel indications. I would never support that, personally. I can understand learning information for understudied populations. Real-world evidence can be used to clarify potential harms. I showed you an example about pneumonitis. In understudied population, it can be used as hypothesis generating. Sometimes you might uncover something in real-world evidence like, you know what, I may take this to a randomized controlled trial because I may be finding a different indication for a new drug. And it will undoubtedly uncover deficiencies in randomized controlled trials. And if anybody is going to tell me that there are no deficiencies in randomized controlled trials, then you have not done enough research. My conclusions, real-world evidence, I'm sorry for those of you who are not fans of it, is here to stay. It's not going anywhere. Real-world evidence does not equate that we live in an unreal world. Real-world evidence is that data generated from the world we live in, not from clinical trial world. I've lived both worlds. We all have, and we know exactly what I'm talking about. Real-world evidence helps in identifying post-marketing adverse events, studying outcomes and safety in understudied populations, quantifying the cost of care. Every RCT needs to have cost of care. Real-world evidence allows you to go back and look at it. And it helps in studying resource utilization. And I'll hopefully end you with a chuckle if you can't read from the back. This is the doctor saying, of course the death was study-related. He was reading the patient information sheet when the bus hit him. Thank you.
Thank you, Chadi, for humoring me with my trying to keep you on time. It's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Aji Matthew, who is going to talk about access to clinical trials in low and middle income countries. Dr. Matthew is an assistant professor in medical oncology and an attending physician at the University of Kansas Markey Cancer Center. He's also co-director of HemOnc fellowship programs there. His research focuses on global oncology, breast, and GI malignancies. He serves as the director of the Kerala Center Cancer Care, an NGO that aims to reduce cancer disparities in India. Dr. Matthew, please.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Dr. Shah, for this wonderful summit on cancer health disparities. It's never easy to follow Dr. Naban to the podium, but if I'm fast on my slides, you know who to blame. So just to give you a background of what I believe in the philosophy where every 10 years, every one of us have to reinvent our own lives. In my case, it was 10 years of living in the US, so I decided to reinvent my career. I moved from Kentucky, University of Kentucky, not Kansas, moved from the tiny place in the US called Kentucky, all the way back to my hometown, Kerala in India, a few months ago. So this is more coming back home, to my second home, from my real home, Realworld in India. Here's the problem statement for my talk today. Why are we talking about all of this? The clinical trials in low and middle income countries. Because India, for instance, has 16% of the world population, but almost 1/5 of all the global disease burden. But at best estimates, our global clinical trial prevalence or frequency of what happens in India is just hardly under 2%. I think this is probably an overestimate. In terms of cancer burden, coming to the cancer burden in low and middle income countries, we in low and middle income countries account for a vast majority of the global cancer deaths and tremendous burden on the economy of our region, 80% of disability adjusted life years. But only about 5% of the global cancer resources are spent in LMICs. And that could possibly account for the high mortality to incidence ratio in some parts of Africa and Asia. Now, today is the day for cervical cancer. Let me also bring up a neat graphic on cervical cancer. As you can see from this neat graphic, every country in the world is mapped out according to the burden of global burden of deaths due to cervical cancer. India, which is depicted as yellow, comes up as occupying nearly 3/4 of the entire global cancer mortality from cervical cancer. So naturally, most of the research ought to happen in this area. It's an important area of research of burden in India, cervical cancer. But where exactly do all the cervical cancer research happen? Most of it happens in the developed regions of the world. In fact, this study from in Journal of Global Oncology showed that about 10 to 50 trials happen in India, but I think that's an overestimate because of the way we define trials in India includes observational studies as well in our cancer registry. So very few clinical trials actually have happened in cervical cancer. In fact, one of the doyens of cancer research, cervical cancer research in the world is actually going to lecture us a short while later, Dr. Shankar. I just wanted to see what is a real implication of cancer research in India. So I actually did an audit on clinical trial registry of India. I searched for all the cancer trials that were conducted in India over the last 10 years. We found 559 studies, but as my point was made just a short while ago, only about 2/3 of those were interventional trials. And gynecological malignancies accounted for only about 10% of the studies. So although we have a high burden of cervical cancer in India, the emphasis on cervical cancer research in terms of doing clinical trials is very low in India. In fact, a majority of these studies were conducted only in India, but there was a significant chunk of global cancer research happening in India as well. Why should we do trials in low and middle income countries? Why? Why is this important? Because cancer is a heterogeneous disease. As we know from our experience, every cancer has a different profile. There could be genomically different, there could be ethnic differences, there could be pharmacogenomic differences. So a drug that I use here may not be the same dose that I have to use in India. Taking the example of capecitabine, our physicians in India use a much lower dose because the toxicity rates are high. Has that been properly studied? But anecdotally, we believe that our toxicity rates are so high that we use lower dose. We got to identify locally relevant, culturally sensitive treatment approaches in these regions. What works in the US doesn't need to work similarly in India or Africa. We got to have some locally relevant, regionally sensitive treatment approaches. Why do we want to do clinical trials in low and middle income countries? Because we know from our experience in the US that the moment we start doing trials, we are building capacity in terms of education, in terms of care delivery, in terms of health services. And then there's the overarching principle of an equitable care. Our goal should be that every region in the world should have an equitable care. We should not be delivering higher care in certain parts of the region of a country and not disseminate the same care into every single part of the world. And finally, we have to put in, there's a sense of justice. We design something, we develop a drug, but we got to have some sense of justice in helping these drugs, these innovations, reach the masses, the big chunk of the global population. And there's a pragmatic sense of doing clinical trials in low and middle income countries. You got to drop the net where the fish is. So availability of patients, availability of care providers, they are in large numbers in low and middle income countries. So you got to drop the net where the patients are, where the fish are. But as we all know, there are a lot of barriers in doing clinical trials. Let me illustrate using this graph. Let's say a patient comes in with a cancer diagnosis. He goes to his clinic visit, and first question is, are there any trials available in that center? Now, if you go to a community practice, there may not be clinical trials in that center, and that's what ASCO is trying to change by doing trials like TAPR in terms of helping even community programs have clinical trials. So the first problem is a structural problem. Are there any clinical trials available? Now, if there are trials available, then you got to look at the patient eligibility. Is my patient eligible for a trial? And that's what Dr. Naban was talking about in terms of figuring out the eligibility requirements. And ASCO and a lot of societies in the US are trying to alter the trial eligibility requirements for patient eligibility requirements. And if, let's say, the patient is eligible, you want to have a willing doctor to spend his time to discuss the protocol with the patient. So a physician barrier can happen. And finally, it's up to the patient to decide whether he or she needs to be enrolled in a clinical trial or not. Now, what's unique in low and middle income country is the major barrier is structural, is the lack of availability of clinical trials. Even if I want to do a clinical trial, even if I want to actually enroll a patient to a new drug, there is no trial availability. That is single-handedly the biggest structural barrier to getting access to clinical trials in low and middle income countries. Now, when I was in medical school, I have never seen a single patient who was treated on clinical trial. The first time I actually took care of a patient who was on a clinical trial was the adjuvant ipilimumab study when I was at University of Pittsburgh in 2010. It was the ECOG 1609 trial. That was my first experience with actually seeing a patient enrolled in a clinical trial. Why do we not have sufficient clinical trials in low and middle income countries? Because we got to understand the root problems. Now, if you look at India, the first most important reason we do not have clinical trials is regulations or lack of clarity in terms of legal requirements or regulations. The second problem, regulations. The third problem is again regulations. So let's now get to the problem, the regulation. What actually happens? I'm going to use India as a case study. Now, the Indian equivalent of the FDA is called the CDSCO. It's a Central Drug Standard Control Organization. It's an understaffed, it has very little resources to carry out its duties. But when you look at the mandate of the organization, you can see the mandate is to meet the aspirations, demands, and requirements of the pharmaceutical industry. So at the get-go, the mandate of our drug regulator is skewed towards the pharmaceutical industry. There are skewed priorities and perceptions. So that has to change. Now, our parliamentary committee, it's the equivalent of congressional committee in the United States, they actually decided to study the CDSCO and prepared a very comprehensive report. And what they found was the pharmaceutical companies exploit loopholes in Indian law, and our regulations are sometimes lax, sometimes strict. It's really unclear what the regulations in certain parts are. And sometimes collude with the drug regulatory agency to get licenses for their products without adequate tests. And the review goes on to sample 42 drugs that were approved by the CDSCO. Documentation for 3 drugs were missing. 11 were licensed without undergoing phase 3 trials. And 13 drugs were licensed to use in India, which were not licensed in other countries, in developed countries at all. One of the immediate culture shocks that I had when I relocated to India and started practicing is the enormous amount of medications that are prescribed that I have not even heard of. That I have not even seen any textbooks, any journals that are not even in print media. So there is a large group of drugs, a drug industry that happens targeted to low and middle income countries which are not approved in high income countries. Now, there is a rule that all drugs used in other countries have to undergo a phase 3 trial in India before they can be used, but this can be waived in emergency situation. But between 2008 and 2010, a waiver was obtained every month for one drug, and sometimes it is a waiver for sunitinib, for instance, or where there is no really emergency need for that drug to get a waiver. Now, in terms of regulation, in terms of the legal challenges, one of the important things that we face is how to compensate for patient harm in clinical trials. Just to illustrate the problems in defining the laws in India, for instance, if you look at the patient group, you would consider that the law or the risk management is actually very lax. From a pharmaceutical company's perspective, the risk management is very strict. So it's very less defined, and there is little accountability for the regulator, for the investigator, or for the sponsor. Now, I'll explain why this happens. The Health Ministry of India actually looked at the number of patients who died as part of a clinical trial, and they found that 88 clinical trial volunteers died in the last 4 years due to side effects. Now, supposedly, all 88 of them ought to get compensated for the harm, for the patient harm. But how many got compensation? Out of the 13 deaths in 2018, only one patient's family got compensated for their harm from participating in the trial, and that too at a much lower rate than is legally allowed. Now, so understanding all of this, the India's Drug Regulatory Agency decided to make some amendments to the laws. So they brought out some draft rules in February 2018, and one of the amended proposed draft rules said that patients who suffered disabilities or die from the trial would get 60% of the total compensation soon after the ethics committee have made their opinion. If it is proven after the investigation that the death did not happen because of the trial, the 60% of the compensation need not be returned. Now, this was a draft rule that was framed. Draft is for discussion. And immediately, the World Health Organization came up with their opinion, and they produced a statement saying that work in India would be significantly hampered if we adopt this rule, because this is stringent rules for compensation. And quote unquote from WHO, we may not wish to act as sponsor, and other partners may similarly be discouraged. And the major concern from them is, if let's say the ethics committee determines a death is related to a product, but the sponsor disagrees, money is paid upfront, it cannot be reimbursable. So the WHO came out and said, okay, we are not going to conduct a clinical trial if this draft compensation rule goes forward. Moving on to another problem, lack of transparency. We really don't have good guidelines on how clinical trial volunteers are selected. So that means there are several instances where cases of volunteers being lured from poorer rural areas with promise of free drugs, therapies, and even jobs. So these are not very uncommon events that happen. The next challenge of regulatory aspect of doing clinical trials in India is consenting. In many cases, the volunteers are enlisted without their consent. Doctors don't inform the side effects or draw up a formal contract. Now, I'll give you an example. In a 63-year-old woman was sick, and the doctor and the son of the patient understood that the patient was on a clinical trial. So in 2012, the son filed a complaint with the health ministry, and the son said, when I checked the strip, I found a label saying it was a sample for a clinical trial. He confronted the doctor, and I then checked the clinical trial registry, and the registry listed some of the side effects, but the patient had no understanding of what this was, whether the patient was on a clinical trial or not. So the health ministry till date have not responded to this son's complaint about the consenting. We are in Seattle, so I've got to bring up the most controversial clinical trial in India in the last 10 years, which is the HPV vaccine trial done by PATH Seattle and Indian Council of Medical Research, which is the Indian government's formal NIH kind of organization. 30,000 tribal girls were recruited to this clinical trial aged 9 to 14 in 2 states in India. It was funded by Gates Foundation and conducted by an NGO based out of Seattle. 7 deaths were occurred, and the trial was halted by Government of India, investigated by the parliamentary committee, and this was the conclusion. Human rights violations were found in the conduct of this trial. Now, what happened? If you look at the critique, the report mentioned that PATH, the organization, resorted to an element of subterfuge by calling the clinical trial as observational studies or demonstration project. It was not even registered legal entity when it began working with ICMR. Now, the other side, from the PATH's CEO, is not all studies of health topics are clinical trials, yet we actually took all steps to ensure that the participants knew what they were getting into and got consented, and the participation was voluntary. But an investigation done by patient rights group found that most of these patients were malnourished, they were recruited from tribal areas, from poor areas, and the consent form for the trials were in English, which the report goes on to mention even the doctors were unable to read it completely. So that's where the Supreme Court of India provided a guideline to say, okay, now we got to ensure we do audio-video recording of all the informed consent process. So the Central Drug Standard Commission said, okay, we're going to insist on audio-video consenting, but this order was modified because it was not feasible to actually do audio-video consenting on all patients in all clinical trials, and this is now mandatory only if you're doing a clinical trial in vulnerable populations and if you're doing clinical trial on a new chemical entity. So finally, after much discussions with the public, with the policymakers, with the doctors, with the pharmaceutical companies, with WHO, the Indian government just finalized the rules for clinical trials just this month. And what does it state? It states that the CDSCO will have 90 days to decide whether to approve applications from global companies, will have 30 days to decide whether to approve applications from domestic companies, from Indian companies. Previously, this used to take 6 months or more. So the way the new rules are finalized, if within 90 days this decision has not been made, then the company gets an automatic approval. Pharmaceutical companies does not have to conduct a phase 3 trial in India if a phase 3 trial has already been conducted and the drug is approved in EU, US, UK, Australia, Canada, or Japan, or United States. So trying to get drugs quicker to the Indian market is the priority of the CDSCO now. Now, these companies do not need to conduct a trial, but they just have to monitor for side effects, marketing studies, otherwise called phase 4 clinical trials. What are the other policies that have been put in place? Orphan drugs. If 500,000 Indians or less are affected by a particular cancer, you don't have to conduct phase 3 and phase 4 trials. They're exempted. Now we are able to use commercial ethics review boards to oversee drug development. Obviously, it has its good and it has its bad. Previously, there were just guidelines to institutions on how to conduct, but now those guidelines have been converted into regulations. So from September 15th, if you're going to do a trial at a university, that trial has to be reviewed by an ethics committee that is registered with the Department of Health Research. And the new drug rules, the new clinical trial rules also allow for free post-trial access to new drugs. But have the organization made some laxity on patient safety? Unfortunately, the organization in their new rules have said there is no appeal for trial participants. So if patient harm happens and an appeal is made and an ethics committee actually makes the decision unfavorably, the pharmaceutical company can go for an appeal. But if it is an unfavorable decision for the patient cannot appeal. So there could be a laxity on getting appeals for decisions from ethics committee. Now, previously, no free drug options were provided, but now these guidelines allow for free post-trial use of a drug until it is, unless there is no alternative is available. Free medical management has to be provided for a patient if the harm has happened, but that is only until the investigator agrees that the harm has happened for that patient because of the trial. And in terms of compensation, thanks to WHO's pressure, the final rules have completely taken out that 60% pay upfront determination by IEC. So the current rules do not have that compensation agreement that was initially stated. So now let me move on to some of the other aspects of the challenges of conducting clinical trials in India or other low and middle income countries. The physician factor, we talked about that we talked about the structural barriers, now we're moving on to the physician factor. Most doctors do not understand the government rules. It took me a considerable amount of time to understand what is happening in India. There is a lack of incentive on how to do clinical trials. There's a lack of interest in trials. I, for instance, during my medical school, have not seen a single patient on clinical trial. Our syllabus is antiquated. Our evidence-based medicine, there's very little emphasis on that. There's very little emphasis on critical thinking. We have a cadre of professors or doctors who are coming in to teach medical students who have no understanding of how to do clinical trials. So almost complete lack of critical thinking and access to resources. Funding is a major challenge. I do not have access to as much funding opportunities as I had here in the West. We don't have enough workforce to run a trial. We don't have nurse managers. We don't have physician assistants. We don't have clinical trial regulatory experts. The doctor has to learn everything and has to understand everything, and it's incredibly challenging. Where are the biostatisticians? We just don't have enough biostatisticians. That is, if someone comes to me in India and asks me, hey, doc, what should I study for college? I would say biostatistics. There's no question about it. You get well paid and a good, safe job. Lack of protected time. I work 6 days a week. I don't have protected time to do research. So why should I do research when my salary, my remuneration doesn't come out of my involvement in clinical trial? It comes from my seeing patients in terms of generating the patient volume in clinics and hospitals. In terms of pharmaceutical companies, what are the challenges? There's not really great data on how to access new medicines at the trial ends. Pharmaceutical companies have their own problems. They pay little diffidence to rules and regulations. They have trouble with getting transparency and understanding that and how important that is in a country like India. And there's always an instinct to take the shortest route out. There's a lack of partnership between the various stakeholders. So I did a study on global research partnerships and in studies that I've done in India. I found 59 research studies that were published in top 5 journals coming out of only India. And more than 65% of those studies had a first author and a last author who were out of India. Now, these are studies that are done only in India. These are not global studies, done only in India, published in New England Journal of Medicine, Lancet, BMJ, and Annals of Internal Medicine. Almost 2/3 of those papers had first author and last author who were from abroad, from outside India. How is that possible? So basically, there's always an authorship hijacking that happens as well. And there's a new name for that. It's called parasitic research or parachute research, where individuals from high-income countries parachute out into places in low and middle-income countries, do the work, and do not involve the collaborators or the local investigators or build capacity. It's not all about authorship. No, that's just a surrogate for how bad the system is. What matters most is setting research priorities. What matters for you in low and middle income country? We got to do that. What matters is financing of research. What matters is data analysis, manuscript preparation, in capacity building. Finally, patient willingness. There's always a biased media coverage. Whenever clinical trial harm comes, it's always there in the front page, first news. There's bad public relations from companies. And there's always a prior record of unethical trials. So every time I recruit a patient or I want to do a clinical trial, there's always a guinea pig, a human guinea pig word thrown out by the media. And a classic example is a research study that was done from Hopkins that when I was in medical school, a very famous researcher from Hopkins brought a chemical entity that was never trialed in an individual, came to the regional cancer center and administered the drug to 6 patients in India. Now, the Hopkins investigated it and found that the scientist was negligent from failing to submit a proposal for clinical trial in Hopkins Institutional Review Board. There was no safety testing of the drug. The scientist carried the drugs in her luggage without any investigative new drug approval, and signed a collaboration with the regional cancer center without committing the university. Now, this scientist did not face any punitive measures. In fact, when I was looking up her name, it came out that she's one of the top awarded scientists in Hopkins even now, very well decorated and have an institution named after her. So when you actually violate basic principles of ethics, you have set the progress of clinical trials or clinical studies in India or countries like India by 50 years back, and you don't face any punitive measures. That's pretty bad. So I listed a lot of hurdles that we have to cross to get cancer trials in India. What can we do to make it better? What can be done to improve? We have to ensure that the policy making is regionally sensitive. We have to have efficiency in government, in academia, in pharmacy, in pharmaceutical companies. We have to have research training. We have to have incentives for healthcare providers, protected times. You recruit patients, we'll pay you X amount of money. There should be more funding opportunities. And more importantly, there should be good, solid, mutually beneficial partnership with expert centers and people. And finally, in the era of social media and fake news, you've got to have scientific education for public and the media and for journalists so that they don't report all clinical trial harms, which inadvertently happens, as human guinea pig experiments and blame the doctor. My professor in medicine actually was planning to do some research, but he was immediately, the moment his clinical trial application went in, immediately there he was put in as somebody who was going to experiment with human guinea pigs in front page of the major newspaper. And patients as stakeholders, we have to empower them. I'll give you an example. This is a patient and a patient advocate, her spouse, her husband. She unfortunately passed away last year. Now, he put this on Twitter. I'll just read it out because it could be challenging for you to read. She had ALK positive, mutation positive lung cancer. My wife celebrated 7 birthdays of her son to see him grow to a 10-year-old boy, 7 marriage anniversaries with the husband to live one of the most loving love stories, served hundreds of fellow cancer patients in India, and earned and lived uncountable beautiful memories. All this was possible because of research medicines. Please keep doing your best, as still someone's wife, someone's daughter, someone's mother is dying in India because of not having timely and affordable access to the latest treatment. Research is not only touching lives, but research is saving lives. So you see how important this is for people, for human beings in low and middle income countries. So clinical trials is not something that we got to debate, we got to discuss in high income countries where the emphasis, where the interest is, but we have to get these trials to the places where it matters the most in the coming decade. Thank you.
We have time for about 1 or 2 questions, so if anyone has a question, please. And if not, I bet we can come up with one.
I got one question.
Yeah.
Okay, so great talk by both of you. It seemed almost as if you had a kind of a double act. One was Realworld, one was RCTs. My question to Dr. Matthews, we all know that India at the moment isn't going through the best scientific period. Lots of fake news, lots of promise of ancient treatment. So the challenges to the RCTs are tremendous. It's not the most, there's a lot of corruption, there's a lot of mistrust. So my question is, what do you think are the challenges to using real world evidence in India? Why would you not take Dr. Nabhan's suggestion?
Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things that I'm working on aggressively. We have very little data. We don't have prospective data collection. We don't have electronic health records. It is getting there, but we just don't have good data. Now, the biggest challenge for me, I'll give you an example. We have 2 population-based cancer registries in Kerala in India, which is one of the most literate states in India. Now, the PBCR data shows that thyroid cancer is one of the highest cancers in women in Kerala. We have 4 times higher rate of incidence in Kerala compared to the rest of India, in Delhi, Mumbai. Our thyroid cancer rates doubled in 10 years, but there was nobody who was looking at that data. So even when we have real-world evidence, real-world data, we don't have people looking at it critically, we don't have people trying to understand why things are happening, and we don't have good data being collected prospectively. So one of the ways I am trying to do something different is using digital health tools. Mobile data is the cheapest in India. Everybody, every single person now has a smartphone. Everybody is using Facebook. Even the least educated person is actually on Facebook. You'll be surprised to travel and train and see them actually on social media. So to create applications where patients can get empowered, where patients can actually plug in their data. So I just submitted a grant, which is to provide patients the tool to put in their financial burden of care as and when it happens, so that I can actually estimate in real data how much of out-of-pocket expenditure is happening, what proportion of financial burden is because of travel and lodging. There's no data available. It's all assumed data. So I'm trying to collect some data using digital health. So I think the way forward is using locally sensitive, regionally productive applications like that.
Okay, the last question here from the mic in the middle. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Abiola Ibrahim. I'm a medical oncologist at University of Chicago and also a medical oncologist in Lagos State, Nigeria. And I just got a job as a coordinator of the Cancer Research Center in Lagos State, Nigeria. So I have 2 questions for you, Dr. Adru. So the first question is, I just wonder why there's so much deaths from the clinical trial done in India. So the second question is, because I'm doing a clinical trial in Nigeria that's going to be launched in July, and the trials is being done in 4 centers. So what I realized in Nigeria is that people come from high-income countries, United States, different institutions, in the same center, and then they cause a lot of siloed working amongst people. So when I get to each center, I meet 3-4 groups of people, some people working with MSK, UCSF, literally duplicating infrastructures. So we have to work together here. This is not acceptable. This is not acceptable.
Absolutely.
We are on the global spectrum. We're doing global oncology. We're in the United States. We have to go to centers in the developing world, in low, middle-income countries, and work together and unite them. If not, we'll continue wasting resources and we'll never, ever get anywhere. So I would really like you to, since you're working in India, to weigh on that.
Okay, your first question, why so many deaths happen? All deaths are attributed to the clinical trial. If you happen to be on a clinical trial, even if it's a stage 4 metastatic breast cancer, that's the parliamentary data. It's not a scientific data, it's a health ministry data. And why did 7 children die in the HPV vaccine trial? Not because of the vaccine, I don't believe it, but the parliamentary committee, because it has happened that way, have blamed it on the HPV vaccine. Because it's done in vulnerable population where they don't have access to resources. I don't know why those 7 children died as a result of the trial.
So I think what I meant is, do you think it's like the physician base? Is it probably lack of training or something?
No. Our physicians are exceptionally trained. I believe our physicians in terms of clinical practice are even better than some of the physicians worldwide. So I don't think that's the case. I think some of it is getting the right data. Now to come to your second question, this is a big trouble in India. Now coming back to the thyroid cancer example that I was talking about, I did this research from the University of Kentucky, obtained the population registry data in India from Regional Cancer Center in Trivandrum, which is the premier institution. I found that our rates in thyroid cancer are high because we are doing overdiagnosis. I contacted the director of the Regional Cancer Center, no reply. I contacted the health minister, no reply. I contacted the member of parliament, I got a reply, but that's it, that's the end of it. I tried to get access to the data to see, okay, can you work with me? Can you give me what proportion of these patients are micropapillary cancers? What proportion are T1? What proportion are node negative? No reply. Now, how can this move forward? I met somebody from Canada who actually introduced me to how this can be done, how good partnerships can happen. He took a sabbatical for 3 months, went to Regional Cancer Center in Trivandrum, stayed with them, shadowed them in clinic, got to know them individually as persons, promised them, hey, I'll take the data, I'll analyze it, I'll help write it, I'll publish it. And he's successfully bringing out a lot of data from Regional Cancer Center, which I did not have access to, although I'm a local citizen. I don't have reach. But somebody from Canada is now, Vishal's institution, Chris Booth, is now working closely with the RCC and is bringing out manuscripts on various questions of urgent need. So good example of a partnership, but these silos can't be broken because of professional insecurity. I can't break it unless I get into the system. Unless I become part of the institution, even then I have silos. So there's a lot of ego, there's a lot of insecurity, but there are ways to overcome that, and that is by knowing people individually and working alongside. And Chris Booth is a great example from Queen's University of actually doing meaningful work in developing countries and building capacity for those countries.
No more questions. Nobody has challenged Dr. Naban, so I'll take the pleasure. So it's more about possibility of exploitation of real-world evidence. You've very well laid out the shortcomings where it can be used and where it can't. That coupled with the fact that, as we all know, the threshold for approval by regulatory agencies like FDA or in my case Health Canada have been decreasing, deteriorating is probably the better word. So that coupled with another fact that all the regulatory agencies have been, have quite explicitly expressed their eagerness to include real-world evidence in terms of regulatory approvals. Now, what are your thoughts about possibility of exploitation of real-world evidence once a drug is already approved because the threshold is low? Because once the regulatory barn is open, it will be hard to put the horses back in. So any thoughts regarding that?
So to my knowledge today, real-world evidence is not used for new drug indications. I don't believe it is. I think it could be used for either expanding the label sometimes in certain particular situations or for the other things that I outlined. Now, I do believe that the buck stops with the regulatory authorities and regulatory agencies by holding everybody accountable to what the outcomes of real-world evidence is. In essence, some drugs could be approved with contingency that we will give you the fast-track approval. You'll get an accelerated approval by the FDA, but contingency on demonstrating X, Y, and Z in a registry, an observation study in the real world, and so forth. That's reasonable. I think what's lacking is sometimes there are no repercussions that occur to what happens as to the output of these registry and observational studies. And we actually looked at that in a paper that we published last year, where the post-marketing type of studies that get mandated by the FDA get actually executed for the most part. Sometimes they're behind schedule, but they get executed. But what happens is that in the output of these post-marketing studies do not necessarily lead to withdrawing drug from the market because, well, we did not really show the efficacy that we wanted to show. So that's really where the problem is. I think what needs to happen is two things. Number one, the FDA needs to have more of a uniform guidelines into when do we require post-marketing studies in the real world. That actually does not exist whatsoever in terms of the requirements from the FDA. And what we will do if we get X, what we will do if we get Y. So that's really what needs to happen.
So I guess rephrasing it, I think what I was trying to say is, should real-world data be used to fix the generalizability problem of randomized controlled trials? Should and can, if that is.
I think the one way where I think real-world evidence could be used to get drugs approved and so forth, if you use the pragmatic clinical trials, that I think is reasonable.
That's different, yeah.
That's a little bit different. Short of that, I still think it's complementary. It's not to be ignored, but I would struggle in approving new drugs and new indications just based on real world.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.